The men did not scream when they first saw it. That detail appears repeatedly in the surviving accounts. Not panic, not shouting, just a sudden, instinctive stillness as though every sound had been stolen from the forest at once. What emerged from the trees that night was not recognized as an animal, nor was it mistaken for a man. It was described only as pale, upright, and watching. And by the time the trappers understood they were no longer alone, the forest had already closed around them. The year was 1874, late autumn, when the northern forests began preparing for winter. Leaves rotted thick on the ground, dark with moisture. Rivers slowed, their edges already rimmed with ice. The nights lengthened quickly, swallowing daylight with a patience that felt deliberate. This was trapping season. Men traveled deep into wilderness that had not yet been cut, mapped, or properly named. They built temporary camps along game trails and water routes, following patterns learned through years of observation and loss. The forest was not unknown to them. That was what made what happened so unsettling. The camp stood in a shallow clearing near Black Willow Run, a narrow stream winding through dense pine and birch. Smoke from the fire clung low beneath the trees, trapped by heavy air. The smell of damp fur, wood smoke, and rendered fat soaked into everything: clothes, blankets, skin. For men made up the party. They had trapped together before. The eldest at 46, a former surveyor turned trapper after a rail accident ruined his leg. He kept journals obsessively, noting weather, animal movement, and distances traveled. Silas trusted patterns. When patterns broke, he noticed a broad-shouldered frontiersman with a quiet demeanor. Kincaid had grown up in the woods and spoke little, but when he did, the others listened. He believed the forest carried memory. Youngest of the group, barely 23, new to deep trapping roots, eager, observant, and still convinced that every mystery had a practical explanation if one looked hard enough. A wiry, sharp-eyed man with a habit of waking suddenly at night. Pike claimed he could sense when animals were nearby before seeing them. He had been right often enough that no one mocked him. They expected isolation. They did not expect attention. From the first night at Black Willow Run, something felt misaligned. Game trails that should have been active were silent. Traps remained untouched. Even insects seemed absent. The usual nighttime chorus replaced by a hollow stillness that pressed against the ears. Silas wrote in his journal that evening, "No sign of deer. No tracks along the stream. Wind carries sound poorly tonight." Kincaid fed the fire without comment, though he kept glancing toward the tree line. "It's quiet wrong," he muttered finally. Mercer laughed nervously. "Quiet's a blessing out here." Kincaid shook his head. "Not like this." After sunset, the woods darkened unnaturally fast. The canopy swallowed the last light, leaving the campfire as the only point of reference in a sea of shadow. The forest did not echo as it should have. When Pike snapped a branch for kindling, the sound fell flat, as if absorbed. When Mercer spoke too loudly, his voice felt smothered before it traveled 10 feet. Silas found himself listening harder than necessary, trying to pick out familiar night sounds. He found none. The first sign came shortly before midnight. Pike, sitting near the fire, went still. "Something's standing out there," he said quietly. Mercer followed his gaze into the darkness beyond the firelight. I didn't say, moving," Pike replied. They waited. Nothing stepped forward. Nothing fled. But the feeling remained. An awareness of presence, without proof. Kincaid rose slowly and circled the camp, lantern held low. The light revealed nothing unusual. Trees, undergrowth, fallen leaves. When he returned, his face was pale. "There were footprints," he said. "But they stop." "Stop where?" Mercer asked. Kincaid swallowed. "At the edge of the light." Silas pressed him. "Animal." Kincaid hesitated. "2 legs." Mercer scoffed. "Bear, then." "Standing." Kincaid shook his head slowly. "No claws, no drag, just steps." Pike stared into the fire. "Something's testing how close it can stand," he said. No one laughed. It appeared just before dawn, when exhaustion blurred certainty. Mercer saw it first. He did not shout. He reached out and grabbed Silas's arm hard enough to leave Bruce. At the far edge of the clearing, partially obscured by trees, stood a shape that did not belong. Tall, too thin, unnaturally light in color. It did not move toward them. It did not retreat. It simply stood upon its surface, catching the faint print light in a way no animal hide would. Kincaid raised his rifle halfway, then stopped. The shape tilted slightly. Not in reaction. In adjustment, Pike whispered. It knows. We see it. The shape lingered for several long seconds. Then it stepped backward and vanished between the trees without sound. No one spoke for a long time. When Mercer finally broke the silence, his voice shook. Tell me what that was. Silas opened his journal with unsteady hands. I don't know, he said honestly. But it wasn't hunting, and it wasn't lost. Kincaid stared into the woods. It was checking distance, Pike added quietly, and now it knows where we are. As daylight finally reached the forest floor, the clearing looked ordinary again. Birds returned cautiously. The stream resumed its faint murmur. But something had changed. Silas noted one final observation before closing his journal for the morning. Tracks found at camp perimeter. Two-legged, spacing consistent, returned deeper into woods. He underlined the last word twice, because nothing in the forest returned unless it intended to come back again. And as the men prepared their gear for the day, none of them realized the truth that would become clear far too late. The pale thing in the trees had not been passing through. It had been deciding whether the camp was worth keeping.
What happened here was never fully recorded, and this is only one of many forgotten encounters. Subscribe and continue into the past.
By daylight, the forest tried to pretend nothing had happened. Mist lifted slowly from Black Willow Run. Frost clung to the shaded ground in thin, fragile sheets. Birds returned in cautious bursts, their calls scattered and uneven, as if testing whether it was safe to speak again. But the men did not relax. Not one of them suggested that what they had seen before dawn had been a trick of tired eyes. The shape had been too still, too deliberate, and the silence that followed it lingered longer than fear should have. The forest had noticed them, and it had not forgotten. Kincaid found the tracks after sunrise. They lay just beyond the fire ring, where the light of the flames had ended the night before. The impressions were shallow, but clear, pressed into damp leaf mold rather than soft earth. Two-legged, evenly spaced. Too evenly spaced. Too evenly spaced. Silas knelt beside them, measuring with the flat of his hand. The stride length was longer than a man's walking pace, but shorter than a running step. No heel drag. No toe scuff. Each mark ended cleanly, as if the foot had been lifted straight up. Mercer swallowed. Could be boots. Kincaid shook his head. No tread. No edge. Just pressure. Pike crouched nearby, scanning the trees instead of the ground. They don't come in, he said. They stop right where the light stopped. The tracks formed a loose arc around the camp, never crossing into the fire's reach. As if whatever made them understood boundaries. That morning, the men discovered their traps had been moved, not sprung, not damaged, moved. A fox trap lay several yards from where Mercer had set it, carefully placed beside a fallen log. Another had been turned upright, jaws closed, untouched by fur or blood. Silas checked the knots on the snare lines. All intact. No animal does this, he said quietly. By mid-morning, Mercer noticed his knife was missing. They found it later standing upright in a split stump near the tree line. Blade sunk deep enough to hold it steady. No one admitted placing it there. As unease settled over the camp, Silas finally spoke of something he had avoided mentioning. When I surveyed Riverland further east, he said, there were stories the locals wouldn't tell near the fire. Mercer looked up. Stories of what? Of pale walkers, Silas replied. Things that moved through timber like men but weren't bound to paths. They said these things watched camps before deciding what to do with them. Kincaid's jaw tightened. Why didn't you say something? Silas stared into the stream. Because those stories were always told after someone disappeared. Pike added quietly. My grandfather warned me about quiet forests. said when the woods go still, something is listening instead. No one argued. That afternoon, while reorganizing supplies, Mercer uncovered something buried beneath his bedroll. A small leather-bound notebook. It was not his. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but legible. The handwriting was tight, careful, and old-fashioned. Silas read aloud the first clear entry. October 12th. Camp established near Willow Stream. Game scarce. Woods quiet. Another entry followed days later. Saw a pale figure at treeline before dawn. Upright. Watching. Did not approach. The final readable line ended abruptly. It learns where we stand before. It learns how to move. There was no name. No date beyond the season. Mercer's voice shook. This camp, Silas nodded slowly. We're not the first. That night, the sounds returned. Not footsteps. Movement. Branches shifted without wind. Leaves rustled in short bursts, stopping the moment someone turned to look. Something circled just beyond sight, never crossing into firelight. Pike woke suddenly near midnight. It's closer, he whispered. The others listened. There was no breathing, no growl, just a faint compression of leaves under careful weight. Kincaid raised his rifle, but did not aim. You hear that? He murmured. Mercer shook his head. Hear what? Exactly, Kincaid replied. Near the edge of the firelight, a shadow stretched across the ground, but no one stood there to cast it. The shadow shifted subtly, not swaying like branches, not flickering like flame. It adjusted its shape in response to movement around the fire, lengthening when someone leaned forward, shortening when they stepped back. Silas felt his stomach tighten. That's not how shadows behave, he said. The shadow withdrew slowly as dawn approached, retreating toward the trees without sound. When the sun finally rose, there was no sign it had ever been there, except for the feeling that the forest had been measuring them. All four men dreamed that night. Each dreamed of standing alone at the edge of the clearing, watching the others sleep. In every dream, the pale shape stood just beyond the trees, closer than before. None of them spoke of it until Mercer broke down over breakfast. I dreamed it knew my name, he said, eyes wide. It didn't say it. It just knew. Pike went pale. I dreamed it stood where I was standing. Silas closed his journal slowly. Dreams don't line up like that, he said. By the third day, the men realized something was wrong with distance. The clearing felt smaller. Not visibly, but spatially. Trees that had seemed far now felt uncomfortably close. Sounds from the stream carried more sharply. The fire's warmth did not reach as far as it had before. Kincaid paced the perimeter, counting steps. It's the same size, he said eventually, but it doesn't feel the same. Pike stared into the woods. It's practicing, he said, seeing how close it can stand before we notice. That evening, Mercer made a mistake. Against his better judgment, he stepped beyond the firelight to retrieve a snare. The forest swallowed him instantly. Mercer, Silas hissed. There was no answer. Then Mercer stepped back into the light, breathing hard, eyes wild. It moved, he said. Not fast, just wrong. What moved? Kincaid asked. Mercer shook his head violently. The space between the trees. It changed. Behind him, deep in the forest, something paused, listening. That night, Silas wrote one final entry before extinguishing the fire. It does not approach directly. It observes reaction. Distance is its tool. As the flames died down, the forest crept closer, again quiet, patient, and alert. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of sight, the pale thing adjusted its position once more. Not to attack, but to prepare. Because now it understood something important. The men would not leave easily. And the forest had time. The first true encounter did not come with violence. It came with certainty. Up to that point, the men at Black Willow Run had still been able to argue quietly, privately, that what followed them through the trees might be misidentified, wildlife, coincidence, or shared exhaustion. Fear had crept in slowly, disguised as vigilance. That illusion ended on the fourth night, because that was the night the pale thing crossed the line it had been carefully measuring. Dusk fell early, dragging a chill behind it. The fire burned higher than usual, fed with extra wood, but its warmth felt thinnerless, willing to spread. Smoke clung low to the ground, hanging between the trunks like fog that refused to lift. Silas Boone noticed first that the forest sounds had returned, not all at once, in fragments. An owl called once and stopped. Something small skittered through leaves, then went silent. The natural rhythm felt interrupted, as though the woods were starting and stopping, unsure when it was allowed to breathe. Jonah Pike sat rigid near the fire, his gaze fixed beyond the flames. "It's closer tonight," he said. No one asked how he knew. The sound came from the north side of the clearing. Not a branch snapping, not a footstep, a controlled shift of weight. Leaves compressed slowly, carefully, too slowly for an animal startled by firelight. Kincaid rose, rifle in hand, but did not raise it. His eyes tracked something just beyond the reach of light. "There," he whispered. The others followed his gaze. At first, there was nothing. Then the darkness thinned. A pale shape emerged, not stepping forward, but becoming visible as the trees parted slightly around it. It stood upright, taller than any man present, its surface catching firelight in dull patches rather than reflecting it cleanly. It did not blink. It did not sway. It simply stood. The men would later struggle to describe it with any consistency. Some said its skin looked like bark, stripped of color. Others claimed it appeared smooth, almost waxen, like something unfinished. All agreed on one detail. It was not shaped for the forest. Its limbs were too long, its posture too precise. It stood as a man might stand if he had learned posture by watching from a distance. Mercer's breath came shallow. "Is it looking at us?" The creatures adore what passed for one tilted slightly, not toward Mercer, toward the fire. Silas felt a sudden, crushing awareness settle over him. This was not a chance meeting. The creature was not surprised. It had been expecting this moment. Jonah Pike swallowed hard. "It knows where the edge is." "What edge?" Mercer whispered. "The light," Pike replied. "It knows exactly how far it reaches." As if responding, the creature took one slow step forward. The fire popped loudly. The creature stopped 1 foot just inside the edge of firelight. It did not burn. It did not recoil. It adjusted its stance, shifting weight as if testing ground temperature. The sound it made was not a voice. It was a pressure. A low, hollow vibration that seemed to pass through the air and into the chest, felt more than heard. Silas's teeth buzzed faintly. Mercer clutched his stomach. The fire dimmed momentarily. Kincaid raised his rifle fully now, sighting along the barrel. "Don't," Silas said sharply. "Why?" Kincaid hissed back. Silas stared at the creature. "Because it hasn't decided yet." The pale thing leaned forward. Not aggressively, curiously. Its head angle changed again, mirroring Silas's posture unconsciously. When Mercer stepped back, the creature's shoulders shifted slightly, maintaining distance. Jonah's voice trembled. "It's copying us." The creature paused. Then, deliberately, it moved its arm. Not fast, not threatening, just enough to show it could. The limb bent incorrectly at the elbow, to many degrees, to smooth and return to its side. Mercer gagged. That's not how bones work. Kincaid's finger tightened on the trigger. Silas grabbed a burning branch from the fire and hurled it forward. The branch landed at the creature's feet, scattering embers. The pale thing recoiled not in pain, but in calculation. It stepped back just beyond the fire's reach and watched the flames die. It did not flee. It waited, as if recording the reaction. Then, without warning, the creature did something none of them expected. It stepped sideways, not away, around. It moved along the perimeter of the clearing, never entering the firelight, never retreating into darkness, skirting the boundary perfectly, circling. Kincaid turned slowly to follow it, rifle tracking uselessly as the creature stayed just beyond range. Its cutting off angles, Pike whispered. The creature stopped directly opposite the stream, between them and the only clear exit. Mercer panicked. He bolted toward the trees behind him. "No!" Silas shouted. "Too late!" The creature reacted instantly. It did not chase. It intercepted. The pale form blurred not through speed, but through sudden proximity, appearing several yards closer than before, blocking Mercer's path. Mercer screamed and stumbled backward. The creature leaned down, close enough now for Silas to see faint indentations along its surface, marks that might once have been eyes, or impressions where features had been attempted. The creature exhaled. The air turned sharply cold. Mercer collapsed, sobbing, unable to move. Kincaid fired. The shot shattered the stillness, echoing wildly through the trees. The creature jerked, not struck, but startled, and withdrew several steps, retreating into deeper shadow. The forest exploded with soundbirds, branches, distant movement, as if released from restraint. The pale thing paused at the tree line. It turned its head one last time, and then it was gone. Not running, not vanishing, simply no longer present. The men did not sleep. Mercer shook uncontrollably until dawn, whispering that it had leaned close enough for him to smell its odor like cold stone and old leaves. Silas wrote furiously by lantern light. Not animal, not human. Behavior indicates observation, learning, and restraint. He paused, then added, "It could have taken us." Kincaid stared into the forest, rifle across his knees. "It chose not to," he said. Pike hugged his knees tightly. Not yet. As the first light of morning filtered through the trees, Silas noticed something that made his blood run cold. Fresh tracks circled the camp, closer than before. Inside the perimeter where Mercer had stood, the stride had changed, adjusted, shorter, more precise. Silas closed his journal slowly, because now there was no doubt left at all. The pale forest creature had seen them clearly, and it had learned how they moved. The next time it returned, it would not be curious. It would be prepared. After the first encounter, the forest did not retreat. It adjusted. Morning came, gray and thin, sunlight filtering through cloud like diluted milk. Frost clung to leaves and fur pelts alike, but the clearing felt colder than the temperature suggested. Not biting cold, intentional cold. The kind that settles only where something has lingered too long. Silas Boone rose early and walked the perimeter alone, lantern unlit. He wanted to see the forest without flame to distort it. What he found unsettled him more than the creature itself. The trees felt closer, not moved, deranged. The clearing measured the same distance from edge to edge. Silas checked with careful steps, counting marking trees with his knife. The numbers matched his earlier notes, yet the space felt narrower. Sound returned differently now. A snapped twig echoed too far. A cough died too soon. The forest no longer behaved like open land. It behaved like a corridor. Kincaid noticed it too. "Feels like it's trying to guide us," he said quietly. Pike shook his head. "No. It's trying to see where we'll go." The men gathered by the fire and made their first deliberate plan since arriving. They could leave. That option sat heavy between them, unspoken but present. But the nearest settlement lay days away through dense forests and rising terrain. Snow threatened within the week, and something else weighed on them all. Leaving meant turning their backs. Silas voiced it carefully. "If it follows patterns. We don't know if leaving breaks the pattern or completes it." Mercer swallowed. "You're saying it might follow us." Kincaid stared into the trees. "I'm saying it might already know how." They chose to stay one more night, to observe, to prepare. They altered the camp deliberately. Fire pits were doubled, forming overlapping circles of light. Traps were reset not for animals, but as noise alarms, bone chimes, hanging tins, dried antlers that would clatter at the slightest disturbance. Pike suggested marking distances. They drove small stakes into the ground at regular intervals from the fire outward, measuring how close the creature had come before retreating. The pattern was obvious. Each night, It stood closer, not by chance, by calculation. That afternoon, Silas found his journal missing. Panic struck hard and fast. He searched packs, bedrolls, the fire pit. Then he saw it. The journal lay opened at the edge of the clearing, placed neatly atop a fallen log. No pages torn, no mud, no damage. Open to the entry, describing the creature's circling movement. Mercer whispered, "It can read." Silas shook his head slowly. "No, but it can recognize importance." They did not touch the journal for several minutes. When Silas finally retrieved it, his hands trembled. Dusk arrived like a held breath finally released. The fire burned hot and steady. Smoke rose straight up, then vanished, as if swallowed by the canopy. No birds called. No insects sang. Pike's eyes darted constantly, tracking movement that never fully revealed itself. "It's waiting for dark," he murmured. The men stayed close, backs nearly touching, rifles loaded, knives ready. Every sound made them tense. Then footsteps, not fast, not heavy, measured. The sound came from behind the trees, circling slowly, stopping whenever someone turned toward it. The bone chimes did not sound. Whatever moved knew where they were, and where they were not. The pale thing revealed itself gradually, emerging not at the tree line, but between trees closer than it had ever been before. Its surface looked different now, not smoother, more defined, as if features were being refined through observation. It stood just beyond the outer ring of light, head tilted, posture eerily familiar. It shifted weight the same way Silas did when standing still too long. Mercer whispered, "It's copying habits now." The creature raised one limb slowly and pressed it against a tree trunk. The bark did not crack, but the tree bent slightly. Testing strength, testing resistance. Kincaid acted without warning. He fired not at the creature, but at the ground between them. The report thundered through the clearing. The creature recoiled sharply, this time, retreating several steps. But it did not flee. Instead, it tilted its head further, posture changing again. Learning consequence. "Don't waste shots," Silas said. "We're teaching it." The creature lingered another minute long enough for everyone to understand that it could stay longer if it chose. Then it withdrew. Slowly, deliberately. Sleep became impossible. Every shift of leaves felt intentional. Every crack of wood suggested movement. Mercer jumped at shadows. Pike refused to close his eyes. Kincaid paced with his rifle until dawn threatened the horizon. Silas noticed something worse. The men were beginning to react, predictably. The creature did not need to attack. It only needed to wait. Near morning, Pike spoke what none of them wanted to admit. "It's not here for food," he said. "It's not territorial." Silas looked at him. "Then why?" Pike swallowed. "Because we're doing something at once." "What?" Mercer demanded. Pike stared into the forest, standing still, repeating ourselves, making patterns. Silas's breath caught. "That's why it circled first," he said slowly. "Why it measured distance. Why it watches us sleep." Kincaid lowered his rifle slightly. "It's learning the camp." "No," Silas replied. "It's learning us." Just before dawn, something changed. The forest sounds returned suddenly, too suddenly. Birds cried out in frantic bursts. Branches snapped deeper in the woods. Something large moved fast away from the camp. Then silence slammed back down harder than before. Pike's voice shook. It wasn't alone. Before anyone could respond, the pale creature emerged again, closer than ever, standing inside the ring of stakes. Inside the distance they had marked as safe. It did not attack. It simply stood there upright, pale and patient, as if signaling the end of observation and the beginning of something else. The attack did not begin with a charge. It began with the forest losing its patience. The pale forest creature stood inside the ring of stakes for nearly a full minute. It did not retreat. close enough for its proportions to feel wrong. Too tall for the clearing, too thin for a living thing. The men did not move. Jonah Pike realized the truth too late. "We miscalculated," he whispered. "It wasn't measuring distance." Silas swallowed. Then what was it measuring? The creature leaned forward slightly. Pike's voice broke. Reaction time. The sound came from behind them, not from the creature, from the forest. Branches snapped, dozens of them fast and chaotic, circling the clearing in a widening arc. Leaves churned as something moved through undergrowth with unnatural speed, stopping precisely at the edge of light. The pale creature turned its head not toward the sound, but toward Silas. It knew where danger would land. Kincaid raised his rifle. The creature moved. It did not rush. The pale thing stepped a single, impossibly long stride that closed half the distance instantly. The fire guttered as if starved of oxygen. Smoke collapsed inward. Silas fired. The shot struck something solid. The sound that followed was not pain. It was displacement. The bullet did not ricochet. It did not thud. It vanished. The creature recoiled half a step, not injured, but corrected, then leaned forward again. Mercer screamed. At the same moment, the woods exploded into motion. Shapes rushed the perimeter, too fast to track, too coordinated to be animals. Bone chimes shattered. Traps snapped uselessly against nothing. Something slammed into the side of the clearing, knocking Mercer to the ground. Kincaid dragged him back toward the fire as a second shape brushed past behind them, close enough to stir the air. Silas shouted orders that no longer mattered. The pattern had shifted. Mercer never saw what took him. He felt it, a sudden, freezing pressure from behind, like hands pressing inward from every direction at once. His scream cut off mid-breath as his body twisted unnaturally, shadow lagging behind flesh. Kincaid lunged. Too late. Mercer was gone. Not dragged. Not torn apart. Removed. The space where he had been felt wrong, hollowed, thinned, as if the forest itself had miscounted. The pale creature did not move. It watched. Gunfire erupted blindly. Shots tore through trees, bark exploding outward. Shadows leapt and vanished. Something howled, not in pain, but in response, triggering movement elsewhere. Pike tripped over a fallen log and barely avoided being crushed as something massive passed overhead, unseen but undeniable. Silas felt the clearing collapse, inward, not physically, but spatially. Distances shortened, escape routes curved away from where they should have led. "They're hurting us," Pike shouted. The pale creature stepped again, another impossible stride cutting off the stream. It had learned terrain. Kincaid fired again, this time deliberately, aiming at the creature's chest. The bullet struck and sank. Not piercing, not bouncing. Sinking. The pale surface rippled briefly, then smoothed. It was not immune. It was uninterested. Silas realized the truth with sick clarity. Silas crawled toward it, lungs burning. They backed together toward the fire, panting, bloodied, terrified. The forest closed in again. Shapes pressed against the light, darting in and out, testing timing. Every movement felt predicted seconds before it happened. Pike whispered through tears, "It knows how long it takes us to turn." Silas grabbed his journal and hurled it into the fire. The pages burned quickly. The pale creature stiffened. Just slightly. For the first time, it reacted immediately. Silas seized the opening. "Run!" he shouted. Pike hesitated. Silas shoved him hard toward the stream. Pike ran. The pale creature shifted, but not fast enough. Silas followed, stumbling, lungs screaming as the forest erupted behind them. Something slammed into Silas's back, knocking him sprawling. He felt cold pressure settle around his legs. Not pulling. Aligning. Silas clawed forward and screamed. The pressure released abruptly. The forest surged behind him but did not pursue. Silas and Pike ran until their legs failed. Behind them, the forest returned to silence. No sound. No sign of the clearing. Of Mercer. Of Kincaid. Of the pale creature. Only absence. Silas lay shaking in the frost, staring at the sky. Pike sobbed quietly beside him. "It let us go," Pike whispered. Silas closed his eyes. "No," he said hoarsely. "It finished what it came to do." Deep in the forest they would never enter again. Something adjusted its posture. The pattern had been completed. Dawn did not bring relief. It brought distance. Silas Boone and Jonah Pike lay where they had collapsed. Breath steaming in the pale light, the forest around them unfamiliar and quiet, in a way that suggested deliberate restraint. Birds called cautiously from far off. Frost glazed the ground in thin, fragile sheets that shattered under Silas's fingers when he tried to push himself upright. Behind them, there was no sound of pursuit. That absence felt heavier than running ever had. They spoke little at first. Pike's hands shook uncontrollably. His jaw locked as if words had frozen before reaching his mouth. Silas forced himself to sit, pain flaring where something had pressed and released him during the escape. The forest had not torn them apart. Silas closed his eyes and counted the men they had lost, not by name at first, but by place where each had stood, how each had moved when the pattern broke. The counting hurt more than memory. "They're not coming after us," Pike whispered at last. Silas nodded. "They don't need to." It was as if the forest had turned its attention elsewhere. By midday, the terrain changed thinner trees, more open ground. Pike's shoulders eased a fraction. He spoke once, barely above a whisper. "Do you think it marked us?" Silas considered the question carefully. "I think it finished with us." Pike did not ask what that meant. Near a rocky rise, Silas stopped and turned. From that vantage, he could see the treetops stretching back toward Black Willow Run, a dark, unbroken canopy that swallowed distance and detail. There was no sign of smoke, no break where the clearing had been, no movement that betrayed watchers. And yet, Silas felt a faint pressure at the base of his skull, The same awareness he had felt when the creature first stood at the edge of the light. Not presence, consideration. He turned away. They reached a logging track by nightfall and followed it until exhaustion forced them to rest. Pike slept fitfully, waking at every sound. Silas remained awake, watching the shadows shift with the moon, refusing to let his posture settle into anything that felt repeatable. In the morning, they found boot prints on the trail ahead, human, recent, heading south. They did not follow directly. They angled off, rejoining the path farther down, unwilling to move in a straight, predictable line. When they finally encountered other men, words failed them both. Silas said only this: "Don't camp near Black Willow Run." The warning was noted, then forgotten. In the days that followed, Pike developed a peculiar sensitivity. He could tell when someone stood behind him, without turning. He adjusted his stance unconsciously when conversations lingered too long. He avoided corners, thresholds, and places where light fell in consistent patterns. Silas began to notice similar changes in himself. He stopped keeping detailed journals, stopped marking distances, stopped trusting patterns that repeated too cleanly. It felt safer to remain imprecise. Authorities later asked about Mercer and Kincaid. Silas answered carefully. "There was no blood," he said. "No signs of a struggle you'd recognize." "What happened to them?" the official pressed. Silas met his gaze. They were removed from where they stood. The answer was recorded and dismissed. Weeks later, against Pike's protests, Silas returned to the outskirts of Black Willow Run. He did not cross into the valley. He did not approach the clearing. He stood on high ground and waited, changing position often, refusing to let himself settle. Nothing appeared, but the forest behaved differently there. Sound fell away too quickly. Distance compressed. The wind seemed to hesitate, then resume. Silas understood then that the place itself had changed. Not wounded, completed. He left without announcing himself. Years later, Silas wrote a letter he never sent. It remained folded in his coat pocket until his death. In it, he tried to articulate what the pale forest creature had been. Not a predator, not a guardian, not a spirit bound to a single shape. Instead, he described it as a function or response that emerged when certain conditions were met. Too much repetition, too much predictability, too much stillness held in one place. When those conditions aligned, the forest produced something to resolve them. And when resolution was achieved, it withdrew. Silas never learned what became of Mercer or Kincaid. He never discovered whether the pale creature had always existed or whether it formed only when needed. He never proved whether it acted alone or as part of a broader, unseen order within the woods. What he knew at Pike knew was simpler and more unsettling. The forest did not hunt. It corrected. On the anniversary of the attack, Silas returned once more to the edge of unfamiliar woods. He stood there briefly, then shifted his weight, refusing to remain still. For a moment, he thought he saw a pale shape between distant trees, upright, quiet, indistinct. It did not move closer. It did not retreat. It simply stood where patterns might form, whether they would. Silas left. The forest remained, and somewhere deep within it, something that had learned how men behave in firelight, waited not for revenge, not for hunger, but for the next time conditions aligned. History rarely remembers the forests the way the men who walked them did. It remembers dates, ledgers, and names. It remembers when people vanished, but almost never why. What happened near Black Willow Run in the autumn of 1874 survives, not as a single account, but as fragments scattered across journals, local warnings, and silences where explanations should have been. And yet, when those fragments are placed side by side, a pattern begins to emerge. The disappearance of two trappers, Zeeley, Mercer, and Thomas Kincaid, was recorded briefly in county documents the following winter. The reports cited exposure, animal attack, or disorientation as the most likely causes. No evidence was presented. No remains were recovered. The forest was described as dense and difficult to search. Silas Boone and Jonah Pike were interviewed separately. Their statements were deemed unreliable. Stress-induced exaggeration. one official wrote in the margin. The case was closed. Silas Boone's journals survived. Not all of them, but enough. The entries from that season are sparse, stripped of the careful measurements and observations that defined his earlier writing. Where once he had cataloged distances and directions, the later pages contain warnings written repeatedly in different phrasing. Do not repeat your movements. Avoid standing still. Firelight defines attention. One final line appears alone on the last page from Black Willow Run. It was not a creature looking for prey. It was a response. Silas never explained what he meant. Among settlers and woodsmen in the region, the story never fully disappeared. It changed. Some said the trappers were taken by a pale giant that walked upright like a man. Others claimed the forest itself turned against them, shifting paths and swallowing those who lingered too long. Old hunters warned newcomers not to camp near willow streams late in the season. Places like that, watch back, they said. Few could explain why. Long before Boone's party arrived, indigenous elders in the region spoke of something known only through behavior, not description. It was never given a fixed form. Instead, it was described as what happens when people remain too long in one place, repeating the same paths, making themselves predictable. According to these stories, the forest does not act out of malice. It acts out of balance. When imbalance grows, something emerges not to punish, but to correct. When correction is complete, it withdraws. Decades after Black Willow Run, similar stories surfaced elsewhere. 1889, Northern Michigan. A logging camp abandoned after workers reported a pale, upright figure circling firelight without approaching. 1903, Canadian Shield. 2 surveyors vanished after repeatedly mapping the same corridor of forest. Their final notes mentioned distance, behaving incorrectly. 1921, Appalachians. A hunter described being followed for 3 nights by something that copied his posture but never crossed into lamplight. None of these accounts reached the same conclusion, but they all described the same behavior. Jonah Pike never returned to deep forest trapping. He lived quietly, working supply routes and guiding travelers only along established paths. Those who knew him described odd habits, changing direction frequently, refusing to sit in one place too long, and never allowing a fire to burn unattended. When asked why, he answered simply, "Some things learn from watching." In his final years, Pike refused to speak of Black Willow Run, but one note, found among his belongings after his death, read, "The forest doesn't chase you. It waits for you to finish teaching it." Black Willow Run still flows through the forest. The clearing exists only faintly now, reclaimed by undergrowth and fallen timber. No marker identifies the site. No sign warns travelers away. Hikers who pass nearby sometimes report a strange sensation or feeling of being observed without direction. Others note that sound behaves oddly there, returning too quickly or not at all. No one reports attacks. No one reports pursuit. Only attention. Was the pale forest creature a living being? A manifestation of the wilderness responding to human behavior? Or something that exists only when conditions align, emerging briefly, then dissolving back into the environment once its purpose is fulfilled? There is no consensus. Only patterns. And patterns, as Silas Boone learned too late, are not always meant to be completed. The men who survived Black Willow Run learned the truth the forest does not announce aloud. Some places do not want you gone. They want you finished. And when the pattern is complete, the forest closes, leaving no sign of what corrected it. If you enjoyed this historical encounter, subscribe for more stories from the past, where forgotten witnesses, lost records, and the wilderness itself still remember what history chose to overlook.
What happened here was never fully recorded, and this is only one of many forgotten encounters. Subscribe and continue into the past.